Good morning, Cornerstone and friends. This morning I'd like us to look at one of the most defining kingdom parables. Bearing in mind that when we look at parables, we're not looking at all the intricacies of the details, but rather the overriding point or points that we find there. This is a very interesting parable because Jesus actually explains it, so that should really make it easy for us. Here we go, Matthew chapter 13 and verse 24. He presented another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while people were sleeping, his enemy came, sowed weeds among the wheat, and left. When the plants sprouted and produced grain, then the weeds also appeared. The landowner's slaves came to him and said, "Master, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Then where did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he told them. "So do you want us to go and gather them up?" the slaves asked him. "No," he said. "When you gather up the weeds, you might also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At harvest time, I'll tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and tie them in bundles to burn them, but store the wheat in my barn." Verse 36. Then he dismissed the crowds and went into the house. His disciples approached him and said, "Explain the parable of the weeds in the field to us." He replied, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. Therefore, just as the weeds are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather from his kingdom everything that causes sin and those guilty of lawlessness. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in their Father's kingdom. Anyone who has ears should listen." So there we have it. Not difficult, is it really? For some strange reason, there are people, significant people in the history of the church, have said this is all about the church. And let's not worry about making a distinction between true and false believers. Well, clearly that's nonsense. This is the world, and this is the Son of Man, Jesus, who comes into the world declaring the kingdom. And in the declaration of the kingdom, it is clear there are two parties. There is a very strong division between those two parties. They are distinct. Now, interestingly, in all of this, we see, first of all, the Son of Man, the Messiah of God, at work declaring his kingdom, and there is an identifying. So there are those who belong to him, and there are those who belong to the devil. A distinction that is there all along. The kingdom that we are learning about, it's in the world, but it is not of the world. It has many facets. It cannot be restricted to boundaries, geographical, racial. It is comprised of all of those people who belong to the Son. They're God's people. And then there's the other people. Superficially, they seem to be the same. This is not dealing with kingdom lifestyle and the distinctions between God's kingdom people and the people who have rejected Christ. It's not about that. It's about the two parties, the distinction, the continuation of this world until the end. And what happens then? If we are God's people, we are in this world, but really we belong to Christ. Superficially, we look the same, but are we? The wheat and the weeds, they look the same. And the nature of the word for weed here is a plant that looks like wheat, but it isn't. So they look the same. They're all mixed in. So there is no sense of the separating out in this life in the way that certain Christian groups do it. Isolation, wearing special clothing, all these different things that have happened down through the ages, the siege mentality attitude, none of that. There is a mixing in terms of life, daily life, commerce, interactions, the way we go about life as it affects society as a whole, all mixed in. And we're not to do anything about that. That is not our business. But we really do need to know who it is that we belong to, because that is going to make a big difference, especially at the end. And so the world continues, and there's God's people, and there's the devil's people. And here we are today. It's exactly the same as it was in Jesus' day. There were people in Jesus' day that seemed to fit the bill of disciple, but the nearer that Jesus got to the cross, the more they fell away. And so it became clear they weren't his. And sometimes in this life it's not clear either. And so we continue. We belong to Jesus Christ, the Messiah of God. Now, in the greater scheme of things, this is all about the distinction between good and evil, the battle between good and evil, and how God deals with the problem. Because there is coming a time when things have to come to a climax in history. There is coming a time when the work of the Messiah reaches its final point. There's coming a time when Jesus will return from that heavenly place of exaltation, of great triumph, and he comes with his heavenly followers, the angelic host. And he comes to wrap up history. The world as a whole, and when we talk about the world here, we're talking about the place where we all dwell. The world of itself is not anti-God. It's a great big lump of clay. Well, it's more than that, we know that. It's remarkable. It's beautiful. It's diverse. But it is the battleground where there is a separation that continues in this life between those who belong to God and those who don't. It's all there in the mix, but there is a coming a day when this will reach its climax, And if we go back to our creation theology, we will understand that right from the outset, God has been shaking the wicked out of this earth. There is our enduring principle. In our present day, it doesn't appear that we can see this. It doesn't appear that there is any evidence of this. But the declaration of the kingdom is part of the process. And we move forward in time and history, and we look to the day of his coming, because something remarkable will take place. And this parable takes us to that point. There's lots of ideas floating around out there about the end. Now, this parable is not a definitive theology of what the end will look like. It is not history written before it happens in detail, what will happen to this nation and that nation. None of those things. But there are certain defining factors which are absolutely essential for us to understand, which are consistent with the principles that we have understood in the purpose of God for creating mankind to overcome evil. And that is actually done through Jesus Christ. And we as his followers are part of the outworking of that. And so we march steadily forward towards the day when ultimately wickedness is finally shaken out of this earth. And this is what this parable is showing to us. A final shaking out of wickedness. Along the way, perhaps it does not seem that wickedness is being shaken out. But let's make no mistake about this. The coming of Jesus, absolutely in history, guaranteed that evil would be overcome and put away. And so we move forward and the day comes, and I think this is very significant in principle for us to really grasp hold of. There is an idea that floats around. It's a big idea. It's popular. It's an idea that somehow at the end of the age, and of course nobody can say when he's coming, or because if you do say he's coming on such and such a day, well, you're a heretic. So nobody dare do that. And yet they say it in other ways. Well, he's coming, and the Antichrist has to come first, and all the rest of it. You know what goes on with that. The trouble with that is, if you can identify who this individual is, then you have defined the day, because there is a literalistic understanding that actually leads to that. But that's enough of that. There are other times and places to go into those things in much more detail. But part of the scheme of that, and I think this is like Christian urban mythology, is that we come towards the last day and it's going to be so bad, and there is so much tribulation and distress going to carry its way forward. And so God takes the believers out of this world and leaves the ungodly to get on with their way. This parable doesn't say that. This is what it says. I'm going to read this again. I think we need to take notice. So here we go. Verse 40. Therefore, just as the weeds are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather from his kingdom everything that causes sin and those guilty of lawlessness. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in their Father's kingdom. So here we have it. This is consistent with good creation theology. God created this earth. It was God. Satan spoiled it. God made a man, took a woman from his side, gave them a task, and it was all about good and evil. They failed. Jesus, the Messiah of God, came. He is the one who continues that. In his cross, he dispossessed the powers. The kingdom is declared, and the kingdom expands. Because this world is the dwelling place for now of Jesus's people. But they are mixed in with the devil's followers. And God's purpose is to deal with evil so that it has no place in his creation, so that it is shaken out of the fabric of this world that we walk upon. And so at the end, this is what happens. He comes and he gathers the wicked and shakes them out. And we have this metaphor of being cast into the fire. And it is difficult for us to know precisely what that looks like, but it's not comfortable. And the main issue is the separation. It's the weeding out of all evil from God's good creation. And then what is left? We are left. Now, in terms of time and history, I think it's all the same thing. We're not to identify a day, a week, a month, a year here. It's not about that. It's the process of final separation. But can you see the consistency of the argument? God takes out that which is not of him. God takes out everything that is associated to the evil one. It's taken out, so that which is left belongs to him, God's people. And in the end, of course, he makes a new creation. In the end, he deals with all of that. In the end, we will be changed fully so that we can take our full place in his purposes. And nothing left within us that could ever spoil. This is a wonderful parable because it brings clarity. It is not difficult. It is straightforward. It is consistent with everything that we have learnt regarding the purposes of God, the overcoming of evil, the place of Jesus, the Messiah of God, in that victory, the outworking of that victory, and in the end, the final shaking out of everything that spoils, that ruins, that is evil, so that what is left is God's goodness. Now, this does not address what really happens to the wicked afterwards. It doesn't go into the details of that, what judgment will really look like. That's a topic for another day. But it is very clear in its presentation. And it is significant because Jesus he explained it. And I think if he explained it, we need to listen. And we must be careful that we do not invent all kinds of ideas to fit in with the Christian urban mythology. That is fantasy. Let us get into reality. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, he has come to declare the kingdom. He has people that belong to him. He is victorious, and his victory will be vindicated on the day of his return. And in that day, there will be nothing left to spoil his goodness and his good creation.